off for presentation. Hi, everybody. Welcome to those of you who are joining us here in Olin Library, and also welcome to those of you who are joining us online. I am Mimi Coulter. I'm the Vice Provost and University Librarian here at Washington University and the Washington University Libraries. I want to thank Gene Altman. I want to thank Gene Altman and the Center for Humanities for asking the libraries to host the faculty book celebration yet again. It's been a tradition for us to host the panel here, but this is our first in-person event in the libraries in almost 2 years. This is actually the first time I'm attending an event in this room at all. Yeah, we are very happy to be back doing in-person events. This is really kind of thrilling for us and really exciting for me since I am new here to get to see faces and get to interact with you folks. So we're particularly excited to be back in person for this year's event as it features Charles Johnson, whose papers the library acquired last year. These papers are an important archive of Johnson's impressive scholarly and artistic accomplishments, and they're a major addition to our modern literature collection and to the D.B. Dowd Modern Graphic History Library, which are both here in our Juliet Edison Department of Special Collections. So for those of you who are here in person, after the panel, you're going to have an opportunity to see selections from Johnson's papers in an exhibit that is next door in our special collections room. And after that, our curator, Joel Miner, will have a few more words to say about the exhibit, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions about the contents of the exhibit. Those of you who are watching online can also read Joel's summary of the exhibition with some scans of some of those contents. I understand that the link is going to be put in the chat for Zoom, so please do go ahead and have a look at the online exhibit. I'm excited that we have both of these going on. So I want to say one more time, welcome, how happy I am to have all of you here and to have all of us online and be part of this event. And with that, I am going to turn this over to our moderator, Ignacio Infante, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature in Spanish and the Associate Director of the Center for the Humanities. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Vice Provost Coulter. Thank you for everybody to be here. Welcome to our faculty panel with Professor Charles Johnson as part of Washington University 2022 Faculty Book Celebration. Our panel is titled Reflections on Craft, Connecting Creative and Scholarly Practice. These are rather difficult times, so we are deeply grateful for the participation of all our panelists today. Really deeply grateful for all your time. It's going to be, we're really excited. And we're also extremely pleased to welcome all of you here. This is such a great turnout. Thank you. This is so exciting to be with all of you, as well as those of you connecting online through our webinar. Before we start, I would like to thank the entire staff of the Center for the Humanities for the organization of all the events today. Gene Altman, as always, for brilliantly leading the center, and especially Alicia Dean and Kathleen Fields for all their work supporting and organizing all the event today. I would also like to thank the University Library, especially Joel Miner and Lawrence Tribal for hosting us today, and Mimi Coulter, thank you again for that warm introduction. This panel and the entire day of activities of our faculty book celebration promises to be one of the most exciting and interdisciplinary events that we have been able to host by the Center for the Humanities. This year, inspired by Professor Charles Johnson's groundbreaking and extremely influential work across different art forms, fiction, illustration and cartooning, screenwriting, essay, as well as across different scholarly fields, English, philosophy, creative writing, film and media, etc. We have decided to organize a panel focused on the connections between creative and scholarly practices. We're very fortunate to have been able to invite a group of colleagues here that do really groundbreaking work in this intersection between both practices. These are also connections that our center, as well as our arts and sciences at large, are very interested in further exploring as part of our collective future as an academic institution. It really is an honor for our Center for the Humanities and the University Libraries to be able to welcome Professor Johnson as our keynote speaker for this annual event today, and personally for me to be able to join all of our panelists today. We have a truly stellar group of panelists today. I was thinking of using the term rock star, but I think rock star doesn't make justice to so stellar group, and I will keep my introduction relatively short so we can start away with our conversation. And we will have about 20 minutes left for a Q&A with the audience. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. Faculty Book Celebration keynote speaker, Charles Johnson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington. He's the Pollock Professor of English, author of 16 books, among them the novels Middle Passage, Oxford in Tale, Faith in the Good Thing, and Dreamer. The story collections The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which was nominated for a PEN/Faulkner Award, Soulcatcher and Other Stories, and Dr. King's Refrigerator and Other Bedtime Stories, as well as works of philosophy and criticism, such as the groundbreaking Being and Race, Black Writing since 1970, and Turning the Wheel, Essays on Buddhism and Writing. He's also a screenwriter, essayist, professional cartoonist, international lecturer, and for 20 years has served as fiction editor of the Seattle Review. Professor Johnson received a 1990 National Book Award for Fiction for Middle Passage, an NEA and Guggenheim Fellowships, a Writers Guild Award for his PBS drama Booker, 2 Washington State Governors Awards for Literature, the Academy Award for Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and numerous other prizes and honorary degrees. In 1998, he received a John D. and Catherine MacArthur Fellowship, a Genius Grant. And in 2003, a group of literary scholars founded the Charles Johnson Society at the American Literature Association to study his work. Rebecca Copeland is Professor of Japanese Language and Literature at the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at Washington University. Professor Copeland's research and teaching interests include modern contemporary women's writing in Japan, modern literature and material culture, and translation studies. Copeland is the author of The Sound of the Wind, The Life and Works of Uno Chio, which was published by the University of Hawaii Press, as well as the editor and translator of 4 other academic collections, among them Diva Nation, Female Icons from Japanese Cultural History, and The Father-Daughter Plot, Japanese Literary Women and the Law of the Father. In addition to her scholarly projects and translations, Professor Copeland is also a creative writer. Her work travels between Japan and the Blue Ridge Mountains, tracing the lines of memory, identity, and self-discovery. The Kimono Tattoo, Copeland's debut novel, was published by Brother Mockingbird Publishers in 2020, and more recently, Professor Copeland edited the collection of short stories Yamamba in Search of the Japanese Mountain Witch in 2021. Our next panelist is Joanna D. Das, who is an assistant professor in the Performing Arts Department at Washington University in St. Louis. She's also an affiliate of the Program of American Culture Studies and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and Equity. Her research interests include dance in the African diaspora, musical theater dance, and the politics of performance in the 20th century. She's the author of the award-winning book, Catherine Dunham, Dance and the African Diaspora, published by Oxford. And her current book project examines the history of the Branson, Missouri entertainment industry. In addition to her scholarship, Professor Das is a certified instructor of the Dunham technique and a choreographer. In December 2020, she co-directed a dance film with filmmaker Denise Ward Brown called Seeking Josephine Baker, Dancing on the Land. Before and during her time as a grad student, Professor Das worked as a professional dancer and choreographer in New York, where she performed a dance theater workshop, the Cunningham Studio, and Dance Now New York City. Gerald Early. So Merle, King, and when I meant it was stellar, it is truly stellar. Gerald Early is the Merle Kling Professor of Modern Letters, Department of English and of African and African American Studies at Washington University. Professor Early is an award-winning essayist, author, and editor. He has served as a commentator for NPR and as a consultant for multiple documentaries with Ken Burns. Currently, Professor Early is finishing a book about Fisk University. He's also the executive editor of the Common Reader, Washington University's interdisciplinary journal that is published under the auspices of the Provost Office. From 2009 to 2012, Early served as the Advisory Committee for Training and Promotion and Personnel, and Professor Early is also the founding director of our own Center for the Humanities. Professor Early is a noted essayist and American culture critic. His collections of essays include Tuxedo Junction, Essays on American Culture, The Culture of Bruising, Essays on Prize Fighting, Literature, and Modern American Culture, which won the 1994 National Books Critics Circle Award. This Is Where I Came In, Essays on Black America in the 1960s, and most recently, A Level Playing Field, African American Athletes and the Republic of Sports. Among many awards, Professor Early has been twice nominated for Grammy Awards. He was nominated by President Obama to serve on the National Council of the Humanities, and more locally, he was awarded a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame in 2013. Our last panelist, our last panelist is Shreyas Ravi Krishna, who is assistant professor in illustration at the Sam Fox School of Design and the Visual Arts here at Washington University. Shreyas is an illustrator and designer from Chennai, India, with an eye for the everyday and an affinity for the drawn image. She makes nonfiction comics, zines, and documentary drawings exploring memory and identity. She explores intersections between visual culture and gender and personal and collective memory through nonfiction comics and zines. Through drawing and writing, she tries to understand how, why, and what we remember. Shreyas is an editor of the Bystander Anthology, Stories, Observations, and Witnessings from South Asia, and a senior editor of comics at South Asian Avant-Garde Anthology. She's also founded and co-organizes the Bat Drawing Club, a monthly drawing group for women, non-binary, trans, and gender non-conforming folks. Shreyas was trained in graphic design at the National Institute of Design, Medabad, and Politecnico de Milano in Italy, and holds an MFA in illustration practice from the Maryland Institute of College of Arts, Baltimore. She previously taught illustration at the Maryland Institute of College of Art and at Towson University. So, as a way of opening up, and I will sit down over there and not say much during the next 15 minutes, one of the things that I wanted to start our conversation with is to think about, how do you all understand the notion of craft as part of your own creative and scholarly practice? And Professor Johnson, you mentioned in our conversations prior to today that you always thought of the notion of craft in terms of the old Greek idea of techne as the skillful making of doing something. So I was wondering if we could start with that.
Okay, I'm still in shock because this gentleman picked this up. This is the first time I've seen the lower half of his face since 11 o'clock. This handsome guy, I didn't know that. So the question of craft, for me, the idea of craft is just making something well. Techne, whether it's the incredible architecture here on campus, or the chair that you're in, or it's a drawing, or it's a novel, or it's a dissertation. It's doing something well and skillfully. And I guess I've thought about this my entire life. I don't want to take up too much time, but I was thinking about something last night in regard to our general theme here. The difference between the artificial separation or difference between so-called creative work and academic works. I would hope one of the things we could do in the course of our discussion is actually define our terms. What do we mean by academic work, and what do we mean by creative work? Maybe as we talk, we'll get a sharper sense of what that is. I'll share an anecdote with you that I was sharing with my friend and companion there this morning about something that happened to me in graduate school. I was a cartoonist and, an illustrator from my late teens through my early 20s, and, I got passionate about philosophy somewhere along the way. I had my eyes open to it when I was 18 years old and had to take a couple of courses as a journalism major. They were required by the journalism school because my teachers felt that if you're going to be a newspaper reporter, you better know something about logic. So one of the required courses was Introduction to Logic. Another one was an elective on the pre-Socratic. So that seduced me, as when I was an artist, into being passionate about philosophy. So I decided I got to do this for the rest of my life. Well, fast forward a few years when I'm in the PhD program at Stony Brook University. And one of my teachers was a revered fellow at the time, philosopher Justice Buckler. He had appointments at both Columbia and Stony Brook. We graduate students were in awe of him. There are three general traditions in 20th century philosophy. One is analytic, which is 90% of philosophy departments. The other is American philosophy, often called pragmatism, and Justice Buckler was in that tradition, and I was in continental, or phenomenology. But we were in awe of this guy because he was one of the students of Charles Peirce. He wrote the first book on Peirce, and then he wrote magnificent books on his own. When I was there, around the same time I published my first novel as a graduate student in 1974, when I was 26, he published a book called The Main of Light on the Concept of Poetry. It was a metaphysical foundation, supposedly, for the practice of poetry. What kind of making is poetry as opposed to other kinds of making? And, I got a great review in the New York Times. So anyway, I took his course, my friends took his courses, and then my book came out, Faith in the Good Thing, 1974, and I got good reviews. He asked me to come to his office. So, this glorious American philosopher asked me to come to his office. Why does he want to talk to me? And we chatted for a while, and then at one point he said to me something that I've never forgotten. He said, I've never heard of someone being a great philosopher and a great novelist. And I thought, really? Okay. Is he trying to tell me something? Is this a sort of hidden, jab or something? Because I'm a grad student, published my first novel. And I've thought about that for quite a long time. Well, first of all, what does he mean by great? If he means Aristotle, Plato, if he means, Augustine and Aquinas, and he means Descartes and Hume, all those, there's about 9 of them over 2,000 years who are seminal watershed philosophers. That's the first tier. Is that what he means? Or is it the second tier? Or is it the third tier? So he didn't define, his terms. Nor did he sort out, what this difference is between, being an academic, rigorous academic philosopher and an artist. So I thought about this for, quite a long time. And I will say this, too. He was a very revered philosopher in the 70s. Friends of mine in philosophy now who go to the conferences, nobody mentions him. Nobody mentions his work anymore. But I have all his books. And I've thought about his question. I will say personally that, and with all humility, there are some things during the course of my life I think I learned to do pretty well and even good. And there are other things that I just didn't learn to do very good. And I'm not particularly good at them. I've written novels. By the way, it's 26 books, okay? Not 16. I didn't want to say anything, right?
That wasn't my error.
No, that's okay. It's a typo. I read a lot of things because I'm passionate about a lot of things. But I tried a lot of things, too, and I know that I'm not good at those things. When I was an undergraduate in college, I wrote 80 bad poems. 80. I was going to write a poem a day. Okay? And I didn't take a creative writing class, and I didn't know jack about poetry, but I was going to write poetry. It all rhymed, okay? It was terrible. And so what I realized later when I was teaching at the University of Washington in the creative writing program, and I had poet friends, and I saw their process, and I saw how they worked, I realized that writing poetry is a cognitive style. And I'm a prose writer. I have a different cognitive style. It's, I was trained as a journalist, you can make a transition to novels from that, to short stories, to essays, and so forth. But the way a poet thinks is quite different. Poet Louis Simpson I ran into when I was a grad student at Stony Brook, and he was talking to a group like this, and he said his poems mature, they have a gestation period of 5 years. 5 years for his poems to evolve and become, what they will become. So you can't do one a day. I have friends who can do a poem a day, it seems. They do, and they get away with it. But I'll never be a poet. It's just that clear to me. There's a lot of things I will never be, really. This man is a magnificent essayist. I am not a great essayist. I'm a good essayist, I think. One reviewer said of my essays that I was a superior essayist. He didn't say great. And it's good that he didn't, because he would have been wrong. I don't put the time into it that would be necessary to be a great essayist. And time invested in a particular craft, whatever we're talking about, the development of a skill, time invested has a lot to do with mastery, whether you're going to get good at this particular thing or not. And, I just didn't have time for poetry, the way poets I know are fully involved, top of the morning to the end of the day, thinking about things as a poet would think about them. I think about things structurally in the way of narrative, a storyteller.
I was wondering how everybody else feels about this same question, Professor Early. I know
Yes.
you wanted to go.
Let's move on.
Yeah. Well, or anybody else in the panel, with this first question.
So he wanted to be short. I started.
I have a long answer for the second question, so I'll
What was the question again? Oh, yeah, about craft. Right, okay. Yeah, okay, can you hear me? Okay, good. When I was in Sunday school as a kid, the one thing that fascinated me about Jesus Christ was that he was a carpenter and that he was good. So that meant he had to be good with his hands. And that's why I understand craft as being, is that you were good with, with your hands at doing something. And I remember when I was in Sunday school, I asked the teacher once, what did he make? And she thought I was nuts. I mean, she didn't understand. She didn't understand what I was talking about. And so, I said, what did Jesus make? I'm not talking about miracles and all that. I'm talking about what kind of tables and what did he make? And she said that wasn't important. And I thought it was pretty important, what he made, and how good a carpenter was he, and stuff like that. But she just thought I was missing the point, about, I was, kind of dumb kid, I guess. I guess I was missing the point. But the reason why I thought that way is because it came up in a working class neighborhood where being good with your hands meant something, and learning a craft meant something. Now, the first craft I encountered as a kid was boxing. And I went to school with two guys who became professional boxing champions. One was named Jeff Chandler. I went to elementary school with him. And the other was named Matthew Franklin, who became a Muslim, and he changed his name to Matthew Saad Muhammad. And I went to junior high school with him. And they both became professional boxing champions. And that was the first craft that I was introduced to and understood as a craft, that it meant. And so what I learned from this and learned from these kids who went into this was that the craft required training. It required a lot of training. In fact, it required what I thought when I saw them training, it required drudgery, because you had to do, because it wasn't something that was just kind of romantic. It was something that you had to go into the gym and you had to do this thing over and over and over again. You had to throw left jabs and left jabs and left jabs. You had to throw left hooks and left hooks and left hooks. You had to move this way. You had to learn to move this way. You had to learn how to move away from punches this way and this. It was like, I guess, training somebody to be a dancer or something like that. It required an enormous amount of training. It required an enormous amount of discipline. And it seemed to me when people were training for it, it was drudgery. I mean, it just seemed like pure drudgery. I don't even, it might have even been drudgery to them doing it. But this is what I learned about a craft, that if I wanted to be good at something, and the kids, I should say, by the way, kids who box well were known as being good with their hands. If you knew how to box well, people said you're good with your hands. And so I wanted to be good with my hands at something. wasn't boxing. That wasn't it. But I respected the idea of the craft, the discipline of craft, and learning it in this way from seeing the dedication of these young men to this thing. And boxing taught me two things. Boxing taught me, one, about the level of dedication it took to be committed to a craft, but it also taught me about the ethics of a craft. That is to say, how am I using this craft? Why did I learn it? To what end and to what purpose is this craft? And boxing presented it in a crude and obvious way because you're doing something to hurt somebody. That's what you're trained to do. And so it was something that I thought about very deeply about, wow, you've learned this craft and you spent years mastering this craft to hurt somebody in a kind of contrived way. You know, you have a boxing match. You don't really have anything against the person you're boxing against, but you're in the ring and you can hurt this person. And what really brought this home to me was in 1962 when I saw on television Emil Griffith kill Benny Kid Paret in the ring. He beat him to death. It was perfectly legal that he beat this man to death. And it was a gruesome thing to see, but it brought home to me the whole business about ethics with the craft. Why are you learning it and to what end and what does it mean to learn this craft and that you've accomplished this thing? And so that learning from what I learned about boxing and my exposure to it influenced me in all my subsequent thinking about craft and what craft is. And so those were the two dimensions, the idea of the practice of it to learn it, and then the ethics of what you learned and how you're going to use what you learned.
Thank you. Professor Krishnan or Copeland, if any would like to.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a number of ideas, and I'm intrigued. I hope we can circle back to the idea that Professor Johnson brought up about the sort of dichotomy that we're making between creative work and academic work, and I think that will be another question that we will have. And I think that dichotomy has led me to initially feel that there was a difference between academic writing and creative writing, and to feel, therefore, that in creative writing, what was I thinking? Who did I think I was to be trying creative writing when I hadn't taken creative writing classes? I wasn't in the right department. I was hired to do something completely different. And so there was a long sense of inauthenticity that I know that we all probably share in this room at some point, a sense of inauthenticity that kind of dogged me. But when I think a little bit more generally about craft, I think about craft as the working part of art. And as has already been pointed out, that craft is practice. And to become proficient, it's important to always practice, to study, to observe, and most importantly, to try, to put your hand in, to get dirty. I teach writing intensive, and the writing intensive is for academic writing. And I can never seem to get my students to understand that writing is a process. It's a craft, regardless of whether you're writing poetry or trying to analyze a book that we've discussed in class. It's something that we continually need to hone. Of course, inspiration is important, and of course, research is important, and having a good idea is really important. But no one really sits down and just writes a perfect essay or a perfect poem or a perfect novel. It requires crafting. I think my students think crafting is onerous. They don't like the process. They just want to be done with it. But for me, I see crafting as play. It allows us to enter the process of creation and then play with it. And I think it's through that form of craft that eventually we arrive at art. So I'll just leave it at that.
I'm glad you brought up play, because that was related to what I was going to say. I think I'm thinking of craft also as language in some sense. My mother tried to make me learn South Indian classical music. So I went to classes for many years. I can hold a tune, but I cannot, don't ask me to sing. I cannot improvise. I also then tried to learn to play table tennis for 8 years. It was a significant part of my childhood. 5 days a week, several hours, just go and play. I was really invested in learning how to play the strokes, but then like when I went to games, it was a little harder for me because I didn't know what to do with that. And it wasn't until I went through the angst and despair of design school and then started working as a designer and then trying to illustrate that I realized, oh, I know what to do with this stuff now. I've learned all the pieces. I understand what the grammar is, and now I can play with it. So that idea of being able to sort of build that skill with practice and dedication, just showing up, and then being able to play with that is such a big part of this idea of craft as I understand it now, because I've done the music bit, I can't do that. I've done the table tennis bit, I couldn't do that. But then it wasn't until I went back and saw some of my old work from my freshman year in college, and I was like, oh my God, how did I stick with that? These are terrible. But I kept showing up because there was something about that in that language that made it feel like, oh, this is my language. I can figure out how to speak this language. That was really interesting for me to like think about recently also, thanks to this question that you posed for us, Ignacio.
Yeah, no, thank you. So we have a lot of really great ideas. So at the ethics of a craft, crafting as play, crafting as language. I think also in terms of this tension between grammar and rhetoric, so the rules of the game and how to use the rules of the game and how to master one in relation to each other. Professor Das, I was wondering if you wanted to move to we could go back to the larger question that we had decided in terms of like the connection between scholarly and creative work that Professor Copeland also mentioned, in terms of like how do you all feel about these tensions which we have been thinking about and within from your own perspectives?
Great, thank you. Well, my story with that is a conversion narrative, because in graduate school I was adamantly opposed to this requirement that was emerging in the field of dance and dance studies that one must be a practitioner as well as a scholar, the scholar-artist model. And the reason I was opposed was because I felt it came not from a place of marrying theory and practice, but from a place of scarcity of resources and insecurity, that dance departments couldn't afford to hire a dance historian and someone to teach in a dance studio, right? That one person had to do what one of my colleagues called be dance Jesus. You had to teach in a studio, you had to choreograph, you had to master dance history, you had to know dance anthropology, et cetera. And I said, in an art history department, Picasso didn't have to teach art history, and art historians don't have to be Picasso, right? And it stemmed also from this craft question where I understood from being a dancer the time it took to be a professional dancer. And I understood from being a grad student in history the time it took to do research in the archives. It is your butt in a seat in an archive for 8 hours a day, or your body in a studio, right? And this came to a head in grad school. Well, I did still have a dance company, and at a certain point, I had to decide, was I going to spend my time to apply for a grant to pay my dancers and rent a rehearsal studio, or was I going to apply for a grant to fund my research? So the other problem, this might be more specific to dance with this scholar-artist combined model, is it led to a lot of racism and ableism in the field, where it didn't matter if you were a brilliant dance anthropologist or dance historian, if you couldn't teach Ballet 101, then you weren't hired, right? But then I had a moment of conversion where I was writing this book on Katherine Dunham, who had been formative to my own training growing up in St. Louis. And so I returned to the Dunham certification workshops and seminars. I was invited to come as a scholar, and they said, we can't pay you, but you can take the classes for free. And I said, great. And then they're like, wait, you're a really good dancer. You should become certified in Dunham technique. And I started dancing again, and it really brought something to my research to do the technique again. I was reminded of the utopian promise of this technique, because as I was going through Katherine Dunham's archive, there were so many bills. There were so many instances where she was struggling against racism and sexism. So many times her company almost fell apart. And doing the technique reminded me of the hope that was embodied in the very act of the dancing. And I started to see embodied practice as another form of research. So in your question about how are we defining scholarship and creative practice, I don't divide the two. I see different types of research methodologies one can use to answer a question. And I started to see the value for me of embodied research as a way to try to understand a question about dance and how it operates in the world. And so I began to bring that back into my life. And I think that not dividing theory and practice fights against other kinds of discriminatory practices in the academy because of the classic mind-body split that has so dominated the Western academy. Whereas if we really, really do pay attention to the body as a way of knowing and as a methodology, not that everyone has to do it, and that is still my caveat, that you don't have to have someone who has trained as a professional dancer for 20 years and gotten their PhD. Not everyone has to do the same level of craft at the same time. But embodied creative research, creativity is a way of trying to discover and learn something. And that is a valuable method of, just as valuable a method of research as sitting in the archive. So so that's my story.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on this question? I thought this idea of the utopian promise of a technique is a brilliant idea. I've never thought of that. That's amazing. Thank you. Anybody?
I'm just really happy that these two people here pointed out the importance of play. Oh,
yeah, sorry, just for the audience.
Is it on? Oh, yeah. These two ladies over here pointed out something I think is crucial, and that is the importance of play in it, because it isn't. Some days it can be drudgery, right? Like you're talking about. You know, it takes thousands and thousands of hours. If you're a boxer or you're a martial artist, you throw this front kick, this punch, so many times it becomes part of your muscle memory. You don't have to think. That's the whole point. You don't have to think when you're in the ring. So it's thousands and thousands of hours invested in whatever it is you're doing. And it could be dance, because that's very physical, it's embodied, or it could be the crafting of a chair. You know, I never thought about it before, but I love this idea. I want to know what Jesus made. I mean, I took shop in junior high school, and I made 2 bookends, and they were lousy. So, like, did Jesus make some bookends? Did he make a bookcase? Carpenter, yeah, I haven't heard that my whole life for 73 years, but I thought he was building houses. But maybe he was doing some, I'm going to shut up. Let's somebody else.
I feel like Joanna said a lot of the things that matters. But also, I think I'm glad you brought up the term embodied research. I've made a note of that because I'm also thinking about this sort of distinction that we make between scholarly and creative, and how craft applies in both of those things. I think it also comes down to which ways of knowing we emphasize and which ways of making we prioritize. So, for example, my colleague Aggie Toppins and I in the College of Art, we got a grant to recently initiate what we're calling the TLDR zine archive. So TLDR means too long, didn't read. And the TLDR zine archive is basically an archive of zines about design, illustration, and visual culture, so that we have a space where we're able to sort of prioritize design as a way of knowing, illustration as a way of knowing, and visual culture as a way of knowing, but also like putting those into a physical form so that we're bringing together a way of making and a way of knowing into the same place. But also this idea of like using design to talk about design, or using illustration to talk about illustration. It also opens up this way of understanding by doing, or understanding by knowing, sort of like what you were saying, Joanna, like actually doing, like actually dancing gives you a different understanding of the thing.
I love this idea of knowing. You put epistemology into this. Yeah, you put epistemology into this because you said knowing by doing, right? Knowing by the visual. Could you talk a little bit more about that? What does it mean to know? See, the reason I say this is because I know when you write short stories, something my own teacher John Gardner once said, he wrote, In order to write short stories, you got to read enough of them and you got to practice enough of them so that you feel the form from within. You feel the form from within. I know that's got to be true for embodiment, with boxing and dancing and martial arts. So there is a form of knowing here. And could you talk about the visual arts and maybe in that sense? I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. I can talk a little bit about a class I'm teaching this semester, which is narrative comics. So a lot of the students come into the class, they haven't made comics before, and they have assumptions about what comics look like and what kind of stories you can tell with comics. So the first thing we talk about in the class is that we're not going to sit and do lectures about here's what comics look like. We're going to make stuff. We'll figure out things as we're going along. So a lot of times they'll make something, they'll put it up because they have some sort of instinct for how they want to put things on the page. We'll put it up and we'll talk about it, and they'll say, oh, this is actually not doing the thing that I wanted to do. Let's talk about why it's doing that and not the thing you wanted to do. Or why is this page calling out to you and communicating the thing you wanted to communicate? So there's this sort of making, like if you put the thing down, then let's talk about it, make it again, let's talk about it. So by making the thing over and over again, they're also recognizing the specific ways in which each person makes comics, because that's also, it's a language, and everyone's figuring out how they employ it or deploy it. So like yesterday we had, I mixed the students up and everyone had to redraw someone else's page. And then that's when they started realizing, oh, this is the way in which I make this page. This is the way in which you draw these panels. They're very different because I think of this in a very different way than you think of this, even though the content is the exact same thing.
See, I don't want to dominate here. I'm really fascinated by what you're saying. One of the things that used to annoy me as an artist when I was going through the university as undergraduate and graduate student were the ways that philosophers talked about aesthetics. Because I got the impression very often that they weren't making art. They were talking about it from a distance. They were even looking at a finished canvas, and then responding to it. They don't know all of the canvases that were thrown away by the artist as he or she worked through this. So for me, I always felt, okay, I've got to stay in touch with the process of making art, and then later I can step back, take from a distance, and talk about literature, from the outside, the finished work. But when I write a novel, I wrote like 6 in 2 years, really fast, one every 10 academic quarter. Slowed down with John Gardner looking over my shoulder. It took 9 months. I thought that was a very long period of time. Then with the next novel, I realized what was at stake. I took 5 years. The next novel after that, 6 years. The next novel after that, 7 years. And researched 6, 7 years for each one of them. I knew what was at stake, and I would throw away 5,000 pages. No, that's not right. 3,000 pages for a 250-page novel. Because you're trying out things. It's trial and error. You don't know. It's just like your student said, you don't know until you see it. Then you know, oh, that's what I was trying to do. You have to feel the form from within. And everything you do is different. Every story, right? Every graphic, everything, every panel is different. And that's one of the thrills of coming back to art again and again and again. Because it's problem solving. But every artwork is a different problem. And so it doesn't become drudgery. It becomes discovery, right? That's the thrill. And sometimes I think academic philosophers of art, if you're not doing it, you're at a distance from it. Fortunately, some of my friends who are in philosophy are also painters. They paint, so they know something about what's inside the process.
Thank you. I don't know, Professor earlier, Copeland, if you wanted to add anything to this particular topic. What was the question? I'm the question person. The connection between creative and scholarly.
Oh,
academic.
yeah, right. Yeah. I agree with what everybody's saying, but it's still a lot of drudgery in this stuff, man. It's a lot of drudgery. When I was a kid, I wanted to be a magician. I wanted to do stage magic, and I bought a kit, and they had a book, and then of course it was very easy. You found out how the tricks were done. You read the book, and they told you how tricks were done. and then I thought, as a kid that, all I have to do is do what they're saying here and I can do the trick. But no, it's cubs. You got to practice and practice and practice and practice and practice over and over and over again till you can finally do the trick in front of somebody and maybe fool them. And you were right about discovery, because what I learned in going through all that drudgery over and over and over again was that I had to figure out a way of doing the trick in my own way, because I was trying to follow the book. And I said, this isn't working, man. I'm trying to follow this book. But I had to make certain kind of adaptations and certain kind of ways of adapting it to my own body, my own hands, and everything else. And that was when the discovery came. Then it became fun. But before that, it wasn't fun at all. It was painful. It wasn't fun at all. But when I made the discovery, it was fun. When I discovered that about myself, it was fun. I say this one thing about scholarly and creative is working with Ken Burns. And the process of working with Ken Burns is that for the scholars, he calls in a whole group of scholars. This was true of baseball, jazz, the other ones I was involved with. He calls in a whole group of scholars. It might be 10 of us around the table. And he's already shot some of the film. And we have a script. And, he has interviews. He's done a bunch of interviews, and he has a script, and he kind of thought it out and everything. And we go, and what you do when we're up there is that you go through the script page by page. And the scholars are there to correct the script. So you go through the script. It's painstaking. I mean, it's tedious. It's painstaking. It takes hours to do this. You're up there for a couple of days. It takes hours to do this. So anyway, we're up there, and the scholars are doing their thing, and the scholars are about, this is wrong, and you have to do that. You have to add this, and blah blah blah, and they're going on, and Ken and his people are taking notes and everything, and they're writing all this down and so forth and so on. Then at one point, this first time I did this, at one point he says to us, we think we're really going to town with this, and he says at one point, guys, men and women, because there were women there too. Folks, I'm not writing a book with pictures. I'm making a film. That's not the same thing. It's not a book with pictures. This is a film. You may not believe this, but I'm telling this story visually. I know there's narration in here and everything else, but I actually am telling this story visually. And it took a while for that to sink in. It took a while for that to sink in. But I learned from that about the scholarly and creative with Burns, about how there's a kind of I ceased thinking about there was a difference. I thought scholarship is creative. I thought good scholarship is a creative act. And then I just thought of it, Burns was doing something different with scholarship that was terrifically creative. It took me about 3 years of working with them, and then I finally understood what filmmakers are trying to do. I didn't understand it at first, but I finally understood what they're trying to do. And, then I said, oh, man, what a dunce. I wasted 3 years trying to, and finally understand what these people are trying to do. But it was Burns that made me more than anyone else think that scholarship is creative. That's a false dichotomy to talk about creative is one thing and scholarship is something else.
You said something. It just went off in my head like an explosion. And it was way back when you first started talking. So I got to back up. I got to rewind the tape. You were talking about, this is how I do this. Mm-hmm. And maybe you were also alluding to this too. Because I have a friend, I get together with a couple old guys, and we work out every Wednesday night. I've been working out with these guys since the early 80s. And my friend's form in Tai Chi is perfect. It is perfect. It is poetry to watch. Every move and the coordination of his body, and it's just like, you look at this, and I suddenly, and it's true with any other martial art form that we do, but you can have that videotape that shows the and you can be deceived. Just like you can have a model in the arts, visual art, and this is what you're supposed to be. No, that's not true, because that person doing it is 6'2", or that person doing it is 5'2", and you have to adjust this to your own body, right? To your own body and your own capabilities. Then you have you've taken the form into yourself and made it your instrument, right? This is what you have to do. So the ideal that often scholars and art, philosophers talk about, that's fine, but you have to figure out how I do this Tai Chi set, and it's not going to look like my buddy Dave's, although I really wish it could. But this is the way I do it. Anyway, I'm going to shut up because that's enough.
Yeah, so to kind of tag team onto that, but also go back to Joanna's point. In Japan, I studied Japanese dance, not like Joanna studied dance. It was more short term. But in Japanese dance and in all Japanese arts, the point is not to innovate or be original, but to copy, to appreciate the form, to try to embody the body of the master, of the teacher, because they're also embodying the bodies of their teachers and their teachers' teachers. So it's this beautiful, long legacy of art. And of course, I came to it late. I was more peripheral, and my dance teacher wanted me to master the forms, but she said, don't be so concerned with the outside. I want you to be more interested in conveying the spirit and understanding the spirit. So she released me somewhat from the heavy discipline. But spending time in Japan for so many years, I feel like there's so much I've embodied and absorbed. And there's a form that doesn't allow me to really express that, to really convey that. The academic argumentative essay doesn't really allow that kind of translation for me. And I'm interested in translation, so I'm interested in ways of trying to convey the inchoate in ways that will move somebody else to understand or appreciate or taste this other place. And that's why I found what we're calling creative writing, I guess, as being just another way of trying to express what I'm already trying to express in academic writing.
So just quickly go over some of the ideas. So we talked about embodied practices, research, different ways of knowing and making, this notion of feeling form from within, understanding by doing, this tension between aesthetics and how to do it. And then I think this was really interesting, the Western and non-Western notions of understanding that connection. And making a movie with Ken Burns. So I was wondering if maybe we only have. I want to make sure that everybody here gets a chance to ask questions quickly. But perhaps the final question for the ones that we planned previously, and then we'll open it up. I was wondering, in terms of the institutional dimension of our conversation today, how has higher education at large and particular academic institutions provided a space for your own work in terms of exploring, but also as a venue for expanding your work, and in what ways do you feel this is something that university institutions can do better, do differently, and how can we respond to that kind of institutional question?
I have a lot of opinions on that. Well, first I'd like to say that here at WashU, this is going to sound like a plug, but it's true. The Center for the Humanities has been very supportive of collaborative research, because I also feel, again, with craft, let's say making a dance film, in my case, I am not trained in the craft of filmmaking. And when I was asked during COVID to make a dance film, I said, I trained in choreography for over 20 years, 0 years in filmmaking. Can I collaborate with somebody? Because I have too much respect for the craft of filmmaking to say I can do this in 2 months. So my department was supportive. Center for the Humanities has been supportive. Overall, I personally feel WashU is a little bit behind in terms of recognizing creative work as another form of research and scholarship. Other institutions, for example, for dance practitioners have created tenure standards so that creative work can count towards tenure. In my particular field, that hasn't quite happened yet.
I think there's more ways to, again, think of creative practice as another type of research, or another way of learning and knowing something. And I think institutions of higher education can do much better with that. But I personally have found both my department and the Center for the Humanities to be very supportive.
Anybody has any other thoughts on this kind of larger question?
Yeah, well, I was kind of nervous about spending so much time writing a novel, and it took over 9 years to go from beginning to publication, and then there's all the marketing. That's just another whole ball game. But I was so nervous about it that even on my laptop, I had a secret file for the drafts called Translator, because I didn't want to call it like first novel or attempt, or I don't know. So I mean, there was a fear that I was doing something inappropriate, maybe, or a little clandestine. I don't know, because I wasn't doing my research. I was doing research. That was the irony. I was doing a lot of research, but I wasn't publishing in research journals. However, now that it is out, I've been given so much support from Humanities Center, from colleagues, and so I feel like my fear was misplaced, but I would never have done this if I didn't have tenure.
Thank you. Yeah, that translator file sounds really cool. As a translator myself. Anybody has any other thoughts on this kind of, or in terms of like how, as a space for this work to emerge or not? Maybe in terms of teaching, I suppose, as well.
Yeah, I think so in my case, because I'm doing research about illustrations and comics, and I'm making comics about those things. So it's sort of like this, I'm trying to have a foot in both things and not slip and fall down in the process. But I think like, I'm so happy that I'm here to do this, because the program that I teach in, which is the MFA in Illustration and Visual Culture program, is built on that idea that you can do both of those things. And part of that whole learning by doing is also, I think, applies to teaching. So it's kind of amazing that I get to sort of like think through these ideas and, explore these ideas by talking about them with students, exploring them in class, but also applying them to my own work. So there's this really, I don't want to say circular, but more spherical. You can tell that I'm an illustrator because I don't have the words, but I have the, I'm trying to draw you a picture in the air. But sort of this way of connecting things is just sort of coming from all these different angles that I don't think I would have had if I wasn't teaching and trying to do at the same time in a place like this. Shout out to Sky and Joy if you're there, from the Modern Graphic History Library.
So maybe we can, Gerald, do you want to?
I just say that I found that the institution has been very supportive of me, but I think that one of the things that was helpful for me in coming up for tenure and everything was being an African and African American studies. I thought that was extremely helpful. The English department was great, and the English department was very supportive, but I was doing something that was unusual in that I was writing these essays. And so the English department was supportive, but African and African American studies, they just let me do whatever I wanted to do. And that was a wonderful thing that, and it was thought to be of great value to them. I understood how it would be of great value to English. I said if I'm good at doing the essays, then it would be of great value to English. But I wasn't so sure about African and African American studies, and the fact that they kind of let me do what I wanted to do, and they kind of let me teach whatever kind of goofy courses I wanted to teach, to explore this, that, or the other thing about how I was going to use my blackness and race in my work. I just thought it was extremely valuable and extremely important. So I just wanted to say that in a way, silos, we complain about silos. I understand silos because I understand disciplines. And I got great respect for disciplines. Believe me, I got great respect for disciplines. Disciplines are great until they're not great, and the thing about African American studies, the thing about English was that it was giving me this grounding in this discipline. But the thing about African American studies, that it was opening up this door to all these disciplines, all these people thinking about different stuff, and that was just very, very valuable. I would just hope everybody can have that kind of experience.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. I was wondering, from your perspective, since you've been in philosophy, but you've been in English as well. What was your experience in terms of in relation to the institutions and departments that your work was kind of connected to?
Okay. I have a lot of thoughts about this, maybe too many, but maybe one way of putting this into context and also connecting it to what Gerald was saying. I was part of that wave of black students who went to college in the 60s. That is at the tail end of segregation. Now, one of the things that segregation did that was pretty damaging to everybody involved, including white students, was that it excluded and minimalized or erased people of color if you were going to all-white schools. It just wasn't there. So I went to elementary schools in which nobody ever mentioned a black author, or even American slavery was misrepresented when I was in middle school. So by the time we got to college, I went in '66, black students are demanding black studies. They want black teachers, because there were none in the schools I went to, and they want black literature courses. So this is happening around 1968. It's happening at Cornell. It's happening at the university I went to, where there were no black professors, and so the black graduate students came together and taught a big lecture course, maybe 300 students. The grad students did this, taking over as lecturers. And I was one of 10 people who was an undergraduate discussion group leader. We'd break the big class into smaller groups. And I remember one of the graduate students in history on the overhead projector put up this cross-section of a slave ship. And I'd never seen this. With these little figures, laying belly to buttocks, right? I looked at that, and it burned itself into the emotion of my mind. And I said, I got to deal with this. So I had to write, for 17 years of doing research and then finally writing, in the 80s, Middle Passage, this novel about, because it was just that image. So what it is we understand that our understanding even of what education is has been evolving and changing. Now, I mentioned also in the 60s, that's when you got, for the first time in Western philosophy departments, courses on Marxism and Eastern philosophy. That wasn't there before the 60s. And those are the boom years when philosophy programs are opening up all over the country. And then it shut down by the time I got to grad school. And they said, when you get your PhD, there's probably not going to be a job for you when you get out of here. But anyway, it was going through transformations. And I suspect even now to this day, the university, I've been retired for 14 years now this year. I think the university is also going through mutations and changes and redefinitions and different ways of figuring out what does it mean to educate and what are we leaving out and what should we be bringing into the discussion. So I think it's fluid. Whatever it is we consider to be academic, right? It has to be changing because everything changes over time. Yeah.
So yeah, Jean.
I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah. Do we need the mic? Yeah. You can use mine, and I'll be.
Okay.
So we'll open it up, and then we have. Is there any questions online? I don't know if that's going to let me know. No? Okay. Right. Okay. So we have about 20 minutes.
Okay, I just have this has just been fascinating. My head is spinning. But I have a general question about craft, content, and form. For those of you who have abilities beyond, sort of the journal article or even the monograph. So is there particular content that you want to embody or engage, and a particular form. So this comes so that this will work for an essay, Gerald, but it's not going to be let's say you could write epic poems. Maybe you can. This is for so I'm just trying to figure out what that connection is, how you decide. You know, Rebecca, you kind of hinted at that a little bit, that there was stuff that you wanted to say and it didn't fit into the academic writing. It wasn't doing what you needed it to do. So you were going to try your hand over 9 years. I think that counts as good drudgery and productive. So you found a way to get that stuff out in the world, through you and out in the world, by changing form. So it's that in people's experience that I was kind of interested in.
I do think it depends on the person, right? So that you find the form that works for you, I think is Professor Johnson pointed out, poetry wasn't his thing. So for somebody, poetry would be the right form. For me, it's maybe not. So I think you have to find your form, and then it will work for you, hopefully. If it doesn't, then you go on to the next.
Yeah, I'm wondering if like this idea of what craft is also relates to how you can match the content to the form in a way that gets what you're trying to say, or what the thing you're trying to get, the thing you have in your head out in a way that is shareable with someone else. And this is something I often have to like figure out, like, do I need to make this as just a presentation at a conference so I can just get the idea out, or do I want to spend months and months trying to figure out how to draw this as a comic? Or do I just want to do I just need to make a quick visual version of this so I have a zine that I can say, you know, I have a first draft of this, it's out, it's not in my head anymore, and then I can work it from there. So I think the luxury of being able to work in more than one form is great, because it allows me at least to like test out these ideas to figure out what is the best way to put it out there in a way that it's communicating the idea in the clearest form.
We have more questions?
Thank you. I might be introducing a false dichotomy. I'm worried about that. But in this merging of theory with the artistic practiced form, do y'all feel that there is a worry about the clarity of your argument being lost? So, for example, like, Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho sets out to be a criticism of toxic masculinity, but 30 years later, Patrick Bateman is like the rallying cry of the alt-right. So when you enter the creative artistic realm, do y'all sort of attempt to ward against that? Or, yeah, am I making sense?
Can you repeat the first part? I hear your second part, which I have a question of creative practice in general, that you cannot control people's interpretation. You can't control that necessarily in scholarship either. It's not like the written word can solidify something in a way. You know, we kind of imagine that sometimes. Ooh, you okay? The fallacy of the archive, right? The fallacy that the written word is in stone and immutable, and that live artistic practice escapes that. I think that is a false dichotomy. So I wouldn't say that writing something down in a journal article preserves its meaning or intentionality better than a work of art necessarily. I'll have to think about it more, but yeah, you cannot control how people interpret your work, and it happens, as Professor Johnson was saying, like, times change, and the way people read your scholarly work or your artistic work, it shifts based on their context, and you can't control that.
Yeah, I think that in terms of the efflorescence of meaning, to use that phenomenology phrase, the efflorescence of meaning, you will find that a new generation younger generation X, Z, or whatever, comes along and they see profiles based on their place in history that other earlier generations couldn't see because of their place in history. Certain things hadn't happened yet, and so they could not bring that intentionality to the understanding of a particular work of art. So the work of art, in terms of its meaning, is open-ended. It's like the horizon. You'll never reach the end of it as long as there are human beings. As long as there's one more human being that comes along that can interpret something, there's a possibility of one more profile that has never been articulated before. So you can't, you nail it down to one thing. Now, there's one thing that's true if you're a phenomenologist, and that is something better not change. There has to be something invariant. If you're talking about a particular story, Romeo and Juliet, you better have a boy and a girl, you're something, or two people involved, or you lose the essence. There has to be something that doesn't change, or you're talking about an entirely different object. But the meaning of that object, historically, is open-ended and like the horizon.
One more. Actually, two. Okay.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how audience plays into kind of this craft, creative versus kind of scholarly practice. And so something that strikes me is that when you do your craft and you create something, that it is going to be consumed by people, and you kind of in some ways have to think as you're creating who will be consuming, and direct it accordingly. And so it seems to me like one of the divisions that we kind of deal with when thinking about craft or creative versus scholarly work is who are we writing or creating for? Are we talking to other scholars in language that only other scholars can talk to? Or are we trying to communicate to the public at large? Or so I was just curious how you think about like the role of audience and whether that influences whether something would be considered scholarly or creative.
I'd really love to hear you answer this, because you're a dancer, you have an audience, you're performing your body. Your body is your instrument. So you get feedback that I am always shocked when anybody ever tells me they read something that I wrote, because I never know until they say, oh, I read. Really, I want to get down on my knees, and say thank you. Because as a writer, your audience is out there and you don't know who they are until later. Maybe as a major of visual arts. But for a dancer, I would think, or like an actor, you get feedback, or you feel something.
Yeah, it's very gratifying to get the kind of immediate feedback, and that's also why I do like teaching in a dance in the studio also, because you can see students learning things in a way that sometimes in a seminar, in a writing-based class, it'll be a student emailing me 2 years later to say, I really learned something in your class. And then in the physical practice, you can see someone learning something in real time, which is gratifying. In terms of the type of audience, I feel artists are sometimes just as guilty as writers of only speaking to an insider audience. I tend to be a populist in both arenas. I try to... I want to write and create for the widest audience possible. I'm not trying to, I don't have to make a living off the sales of anything, so I'm in a very privileged place to be able to, I do want, so yeah. That's my thoughts on that, is just artists and scholars alike can both be rather insidery or kind of as accessible as they on both ends. I'm rambling a little here, so I'm going to stop.
I think about audience all the time. I'm with you about wondering if they're out there, but I do think about the audience all the time, and I'm thinking about how anything I'm writing is affecting any particular portion of an audience. You're thinking that you're writing something and it's for everybody, but automatically it's not for everybody at all. First of all, I have to exclude all people who cannot read. Then I have to exclude all people who do not read in English. And so, you have to, then after I exclude all those people, which is quite a number of people, then I have to think about the people who can read in English, who might be interested in what I am writing, and then that becomes a much smaller number of people. So, but that number, those people, it's important for me to think about them, because I have to think about when I'm using my craft, and I talked earlier about being ethical with my craft, part of that has to do with authenticity and being authentic with an audience, that an audience has to feel as though I'm saying something that is authentic to them, that I have some, in other words, the authenticity is part of having some kind of authority to say something to this audience that this audience feels matters to them, that they ought to read it, that they might get something from it. So yeah, I think about the audience all the time and those kind of issues. Also, as a black person, I think about audiences as black and white. Now, I remember I was at a conference, man, like 15 years ago, and I said this at a literary conference that, as a black writer, I think about black audience and white audience, and how they will come to a work different. And man, those people on that panel, boy, they just tore me up. They just say, how can you say something like that? You racialize, and then, they just went to town on me. I said, wow, I just thought this was like, I didn't even understand how this was a controversy, man. These people just said, you shouldn't be thinking about race. You should, I said, so at any rate, I'm saying it here, and I'm hoping that this panel is not going to do that to me. But, I'm kind of sensitive about that after what happened the last time.
But I want to ask you a question, because you mentioned this twice. Now, I really want to know the dimensions and the fullness of what you mean when you talk about craft and you talk about ethics. What are the ethics involved with a craft? Now, you used an example before, boxing, but what would be some other examples? I'm curious.
Well, I feel as though, I remember what James Baldwin said once. I want to be an honest man and a good writer. And so I like to try to be that too. And I feel that being honest is not necessarily synonymous with being frank. There's a lot of frankness out there. You can get tons of frankness on social media. It's not necessarily people being honest because they're being frank. And I feel as though I owe my audience, when I'm doing something, my greatest ability as a writer, I feel I owe them that level of respect that whatever I'm writing, I'm putting in everything I can to make this a very good piece of writing. And I feel I owe them a certain level of honesty, and if I'm not being honest, then I'm not being ethical. That's the long and short of it. So that's what I mean by that.
See, I think I think we're on the same page with this. I always say, maybe redundantly until people get sick of it, what writing gives me a chance to do is bring my best thought, my best feeling, and my best technique to something. Now, I'm going to give you an example, and it's going to be really fast because I don't want to take up too much time, but it was something John Gardner once said. He gave a reading somewhere, and there's a Q&A, sort of like you're doing right now. Afterwards, a lady raised her hand, and she said, you know what? I think I like your writing, but I don't think I like you. And he said, that's fine. Actually, I'm a better person when I'm writing. If I'm talking to you right now, I'm extemporaneous. I might choose the wrong word. I might insult somebody inadvertently. It's coming out, and I have to let you edit it. But when I'm writing, I can go over this 100 times. I can check every word and think in advance about how it might be received. Every sentence. In other words, I can come close to achieving something like perfection if I'm willing to work on it long enough and hard enough. So I'm a better person when I'm creating than when I'm just just spewing forth words right here, right? So I say best thought, best feeling, best technique. And how often in the course of our lives do we have a chance, a shot, whether it's dance or whether it's say visual arts or any other thing, creative writing, poetry, how often do we have a chance to just about come that close to making something perfect? And it's a gift for others. And it ain't about money, and it's not about fame and fortune. It's about the best you can give to another human being as a gift. You know, when I was a kid, like early teens, I would look at a great piece of art. Man, I'd say, oh my God, this is beauty. And I would think, artists have to be the happiest people in the world because they can make beauty. And then 4 or 5 years later, I go to college and I start meeting artists. And they're the most unhappy human beings I ever saw. I said, what's wrong? You can make beauty, man. There's no amount of money or any, just, that's fantastic. So I love great artists in all disciplines, and I'm grateful to them for what they gave to me. And you give, the best way to deal with something given to you as art is to respond with art. That's your gift. That's your response back to, you know, the world.
Wow. So if we're okay with questions, what a way to wrap it up. That's amazing. So thank you so much for all your time. It was a wonderful panel. Thank you so much for all your time and your work. Thank you all for being here. It was really energizing and amazing. Joel, I don't know if you want to wrap it up quickly for the...
Sure, yeah. I'll just use this. I wanted to invite everybody. Next door, we have a pop-up exhibit from Charles Johnson's papers, which we acquired last year. They're currently being processed, so this is like a preview of the whole, what will be available to researchers very soon. So we're very excited about it. And, you know, it's a small space. It's a huge archive, but hopefully it's a good representation of all of Dr. Johnson's great accomplishments and the exciting things that are in the archive. I'm sorry to say there is no undergraduate poetry, though. I didn't find any of that in the archive, but maybe you didn't. Maybe you hid it. I don't know. And we're going to go right through these doors if you can. If you can't make it, you want to come back later. It's going to be there until April 1st, so about a month.